and I really appreciate the opportunity to share it with you all. Thank you for being here. So how did I start? Why silos? It really stems from my interest in the rural landscape. I grew up in Unadilla Forks, which is right near West Winfield, and one day driving down Hackley Street, past my family's old dairy farm, which was out of operation before I was born, I noticed these 3 silos that had always been there, always been a part of my life, always told me I was about a mile away from home, and they were gone. These fixtures in the landscape just weren't there anymore. So that's what I used to see driving home. And this is a video that a cousin shared with me. So I wasn't here to see this, but this is how they take them down. So there's a guy at the bottom of the screen just hitting it with a sledgehammer and then running. And eventually, that's what happens.
No explosives.
Just knocking it. So they cut the wire hoops up a certain height, and then they're just hitting a stave one at a time until they hit the one that will bring it down. But it's not an exact science. And this is the reason that a lot of them are not taken down. So this is what was left. And this was also coupled with a comment that my dad came home and said to me. He was at a meeting and this photographer said to him, you know, someone better start documenting the silos before they're all gone. And that made me very aware that these fixtures in the landscape were maybe not as fixed. They weren't as permanent as I originally thought. They were telling us something was changing. So this landscape that you're probably very familiar with this around here as well. You look out and you see these vertical structures in the landscape. And they're white and they're pretty prominent, or they're blue with white caps. And this idea of a silo attached to a barn starting to look more like this. So a lot of times the barn will disappear first, but the silo will remain. This is a picture from where I live now in Cazenovia on Thompson Road. It's a part of Kurt's Farms. And they started taking down this barn since, we've been there a year and they've been working on this. Every day I check to make sure the silo is still there. And it's still there, so we'll see. But this picture really captures that process of change. So usually after a farm ceases operation, the barn will go first and the silo remains, and it becomes sort of either a backdrop to a new surrounding or a backdrop to just a different type of farming, a different scale. So this is the way silage is usually presented in the landscape now, either in these bags or as large mounds, usually covered with tires. And what's interesting is it often takes a bulldozer to get the silage from these mounds, so just a much larger scale. So I really see silos as indicators. They're telling us something about landscape. They're visual evidence of culture. And because I'm interested in museum practices as well, this project became an integration of the 2 fields. So I view landscape as a museum. And the objects that we place, that we build on the landscape, tells us something about culture, who we are and where we are at a moment in time. So what I wanted to do was exactly what that photographer was suggesting to my father. He was in his 90s when he made that comment, and he said he couldn't do it, and he was concerned that no one would. So I decided, well, I need a project for my thesis. This is what I'm going to do. This is very close, this area is very close to my heart. So I decided I would document. And again, I'm no historian, and I'm certainly no photographer. But I wanted to approach the silo like you would an object in the museum. First document, then study, research it, and then represent it to the public, to offer it up for viewing so that we could study it more closely. Because instead of seeing a landscape with silos in it, I wanted to look at the silo. So this was my study area. It's along Route 8. It's 2 miles on either side of Route 8, and it goes from just south of Utica to about South Brookfield or Columbus. And I first mapped all the silos using Google Earth. So on the computer, I was zooming in on this study area and placing pins where I thought there were silos. But then, sometimes it was questionable. Is it a swimming pool? Is it a silo? So then I drove to each site. And I documented. It was 160 silos on 93 properties. It covered Oneida, Otsego, Madison County, and the towns of Whitestown, New Hartford, Paris, Bridgewater, Plainfield, Brookfield, and Edmonston. And that's my dad. He was my research assistant. We were measuring the diameter of each silo, trying to get an approximate age. A lot of times that would come from tax maps because they're listed as improvements. We would try to gauge the height, the material, and then I would step a certain number of feet away from the silo and take an image. And we were knocking on doors and asking people, can I document your silos? So my dad, he was along for the ride, but he really became sort of a mediator for me. They knew him, they knew the name, they knew the farm name, Gatesdale, and as soon as we said that, it wasn't just this crazy request from me, it was interesting to them. They really embraced us. And because of that, I not only ended up with a collection of silos, I had a collection of stories. So people would invite me in, we'd sit at the kitchen table and they'd talk about their silos. It was an amazing experience. And we did it in the dead of winter. So what it created was sort of these stark images, a white background, and silos. And because we were a set distance away, they're all on the same plane. So you get a sense of scale and height. And you get a little bit of context in each image. So you start to see what's going on around these silos. And they almost become witnesses as well. So they're indicators, but they're there and they're seeing change as well, happening around them. So it was from this collection that I began curating and researching and learning about what I had, what it was saying and what it was telling me. This one's leaning, probably about to fall down. Still there, I check on that one a lot too. And this is from a farm I just recently learned is going to stop dairy farming. So these were in use, but they won't be much longer. And this is one of the oldest, attached right to the barn. So in this collection, I could start to see similarities and differences. So silos were they were built to store and ferment grain for feed. And in the materiality of these objects, you can see a progression from the purely functional. So you have wood silos like this one with horizontal staves, very rare. They were built usually by farmers or by some local builder. They were built at a scale where they could be loaded by hand and unloaded. So a lot of times farmers would climb up inside and they're using a pitchfork to shovel out the silage. A lot of the early ones were built right into the barn. And then they might have been adapted later. This is another example of a wooden silo, getting a little bit taller. Then you also had a concrete, monolithic concrete. So this is like a poured concrete silo, still at the scale where they're loaded and unloaded by hand. This one, these round ovals, these were doors. So there were wooden doors that covered these that they would open up as the silage went down. This is a metal one, and in this image you can see this is an automatic blower, so you start to see these white PVC pipes. And that shows a progression towards a more automated type of loading. And then you started to see more stylized silos. So this iconic top was manufactured by the Unadilla company, silo company, that was right near Leonardsville in Unadilla, New York. You would see, and you can still find these weather vanes with the name of the manufacturer. So this was really when silos started to transform from just a functional object to a symbolic one. Each company had their own style or thing that they added to the silo. It wasn't just about function. The crane silo was a patent that was put in by a guy from Brookfield, New York. And the Preston Lansing silo. So this was a clay tile silo that really started to mark this transformation of silo as symbolic. Design that means beauty. So this is an advertisement for that company's silo. And in World War I, these are advertisements where the government is encouraging people to buy silos. Save them with a silo and help win the war. And then you come to the harvest store silos. So these are very, very stylized, and you can really see this appeal by a manufacturer to provide more value to the customer. So you can add an American flag or put the name of your farm on your silo now. And it becomes a status symbol. These vertical pillars in the landscape really indicate which farm is able to afford a silo and is at that scale. This was one of my favorite advertisements that I found from Harvest Store. They had door-to-door salesmen. Those are salt and pepper shakers that they would give away to people who purchased one of their silos. And it wasn't seen as just a silo, it was part of an entire system. So your farm was no longer just about you and your cows, it was a system, and a well-managed system had a silo on it. They would also do bus tours. They would take farmers out to farms that had harvest stores and show them how they were working. So this is my collection along the landscape. And the other thing, in addition to materiality and age of the silos, I was looking at where they were located. And I started to notice some themes. So there's sort of this divider line, which is Route 20. And you have a lot of silos north of that and a lot of silos south of that. And the silos closer to Utica, which is up here, tended to be on smaller parcels, smaller land pieces with a higher property value. And I called these relics. So those are the objects you would find in a museum that are incredibly rare. You don't see them everywhere. They're valuable and they're sort of protected. And that would be these silos that I would find on a front lawn of a house in the middle of an urban area. This is in Whitestown. Or silos that were being maintained as part of this ideal aesthetic, this rural place, so well, painted, well kept up. Then as you traveled further south, more into the suburbs, on the outskirts of the urban area, you'd find images like this. So I call these remnants. They're pieces of an object. They're like the handle to an ancient teapot or something. They're telling you something used to be there, but not giving you the whole picture. This is another sort of remnant. The land is for sale, but you have these two silos off in the distance. There are also a lot of ruins in that area. So this silo, this is the horizontal stave wooden silo that I showed you. This did not show up on the Google Maps. We were driving down the road and it just happened to catch our eye. It was quite the find. I was on an abandoned property, so we didn't ask permission, but got a good picture of it. And this is another sort of ruin, a silo in the process of coming down. But then you'd also find silos still being used as tools, but a new type of farming practice, or a different than what we typically see. This is an Amish farm, and they've taken a concrete stave silo, they've deconstructed it, and they've reconstructed it at a smaller scale. Very skinny and narrow, and that's why it has that sort of mottled colored appearance, because it staves from all different silos. So the Amish will still use silos. This one does have an automatic loader, but we did meet a lot of them that said they unload them by hand. There are also silos still being used as grain bins. This is a larger farm closer to New Hartford. So not using it to ferment the grain, just as storage. But it wasn't always dependent on location. There were always these pockets that I'd find of farms still in production, still using the silo in the way that it was intended to be used. This is a dairy farm just outside of Bridgewater. He was actually unloading it the day I was there. It has that really great smell too, so it was neat. And the cows were all outside getting very excited. So you still see these farms that create a landscape of a barn and 2 or 3 silos. Still a part of a rural landscape. Let's move over here. So in conclusion, this project was really about noticing, about paying attention to what we see in the landscape and questioning it. And that's really the purpose of viewing landscape as museum. It's telling us something about the past, but it also evokes something from the present. So we all have stories to tell. I have the story of seeing the silos on my family farm disappear. A lot of people have very sad stories about losing someone in an accident. They were very dangerous to climb up. And a lot of times it happened quickly, and it was impossible to get people out of those silos. So they evoke something from the current generation. They tell us something about the past, and then they sort of suggest a future or question, what is the future? And that's something that weighs on my mind a lot growing up in this area. You know, what is the future of this rural landscape? What is the future of farming? And how will it look in the future? How will farming change? I'm curious to see that. I'm interested. I love landscape as a visual thing. And most importantly, I think documentation is so important. I think that's what historical societies do best, because they allow us to capture what it is the past is evoking from the present. Those stories, those images. And it's important to document before it all disappears. So this is another farm still in production using 4 silos. And my hope is that it will continue to be able to operate at that scale. But I also hope that in my future I'll have the opportunity to return to this collection to go back, to drive that area and see how it's changed. So in a way, it's sort of a benchmark for me. And that's why I love, wherever I am, whether I'm visiting home or I'm now here in Cazenovia, I find those indicators. Right now, it's that silo up the road that I get to run by, or I walk my dogs by, so I keep an eye on it. And it's a way to be present in our communities and to start to pay attention to what's around us. So, and part of the, talking about what this history means for the present, I'd love to open it up to comments and stories and discussions. I'm sure a lot of you have had a lot more experience with silos than I have, so I encourage your thoughts.
Okay, I think we'll start with Harvey Steele.
Oh, Kelly, will you read the month already? And he said the barn was bigger and the silo was added after they got the barn built. And it is wooden stave, it's still up. I think it's over 100 years old. There's an octagon silo not too far from here in the town of Pompey on the old Kellish farm. I don't know when that was built. It's still partially there. There are several wooden silos, I'm sure, all over the place. I believe there's a square silo still at the Knapp farm that was built when the barn was built. Other comments? Pull my card here to see what I had to say. Had to make some notes. We had a steel silo. I noticed you had a couple in the picture.
Yeah.
That steel silo went over after the acid from all the silages ate into it. And one night I didn't hear the noise. I was pretty young at the time, but I was old enough to feed the cattle. And silo went over without hitting the barn. We had a big metal tube out there, and we had to go out with a silage cart, the old silage cart, and bring some of the silage in. We had another neighbor that had a cement concrete stave silo, about tipped over, but Woodford Brothers came to the rescue and saved that one. Silos took a lot of maintenance. Everything had to go up a 9-inch pipe, and then when you went to get it out, you either grabbed the 10-tine fork, or you ended up buying a silo loader. I had a partnership with my dad in the late 50s. We added a silo at the end of the 50s, right in there, 59, 60. And it worked out okay, but like I said, everything went up a 9-inch pipe. We did put unloaders in those silos. We didn't have tripods. We had to pull the unloaders to the top every time, take the silo unload apart, pull it up to the top every time. And quite a chore. 10 years later, my dad and I, mostly me, I guess, decided that I wanted to add on to the barn again. So I went to some of the extension trips, and one of the trips went to Connecticut, and they were just starting to get into bunker silos. In fact, some of the silos at the farms we visited were bunkers, and they were in the quarries that you always hear about in Vermont and Connecticut. A year or two later, I took a trip to California, extension trip, and I come home from that trip. We saw a lot of cows in yards with 30 acres there in California that are not there anymore. And a lot of those animals were fed hay and the silage was brought in. But I saw calf hutches, I saw how things were done out there. I come back and I told my dad I want to add onto the barn, but I don't want to build any more silos. And we didn't. We dug a little partial bunker silo in the back, and that led to a 50 by 130 bunker silo. And the maintenance and all the work of getting that ground silo to work was, we were glad we went to the bunker silos.
I
It's incredible what the acid from the silage can do to eat all of these materials. I mean, wood, and you can see, I think that was another reason for that progression of material over time. Is that even on the concrete, it eats away at the concrete and weakens it. So the Harvestor, again, was another attempt to deal with those issues. But then you're building them so tall that you had the issue of unloading them. And those unloaders would present problems. And you're dealing with mechanical systems. So they were very efficient, but also very complicated pieces of machinery. Actually, I have a piece of a Preston Lansing silo over there on the floor that I can bring it back. It's one of the clay tiles, and the property owner let us have it because the tiles were falling. And it's stamped with the Preston Lansing company seal, but it was another attempt, to use a material that wouldn't eat away so quickly from the silage.
I've made the statement, heard the statement, I'm sure, but as I drive around the country, I still see the solid concrete stave silos without a roof. Some of those are going to be around for a long time. I feel the next generation, the next set of people coming through with the way farms are today, they're going to say, what were those round things used for? Today, big piles, giant piles. Out in the Midwest, there's piles at 20,000 ton for some of these big operations. Quite a few piles right here in the area, quite a few bunker silos right here in the area, but not many silos being built anymore. I can add that the Mennonites and the Amish still have silos, and they're pretty narrow because they have to pitch them out with a fork. You go over into Nider County and so on, and I was there a while back, saw quite a few little silos with tin roofs, very narrow, but they're still building their own silos.
When I talk to some of the Amish farmers, say this is how we unload the silo. So it works for them, it makes a lot of sense. And they were very welcoming and allowed us to go onto their property and see how they were using the silos, but building them at a much smaller scale.
Light on?
Now, just a minute. Randy loves old barns, and he's from the Casanova area. There. I'll give it about 3 seconds. Okay,
Find its energy.
see if it works now.
Okay, Emily, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hold it right up to your mouth.
I got a treat for you, Emily.
All right.
I'm from Cass, and I do the history of barn building in New York State. And one of my slides has to do with a barn that you drive by every day. You may even run by it. And there's 2 silos together. And one of the silos is a concrete stave. And that's not the silo that I was taking a picture of.
Switch.
Can you hear me now? This better?
That's better.
Okay. On the Meadows farm, in one corner of the barn is a silo that was built in the late 19th century, in the 1880s when silos were first introduced on the landscape. And it was actually a foundation of stone that just had a regular roof over it. And the date stone is 86, I believe, 1886. And so it's one of the first silos in the country, right here in Casanova.
I'll have to go document it. It's incredible.
Okay, anybody else?
Silo, when did silos introduced into farming because it was a change in how farms were handled?
They started experimenting with silos in 1875 at the University of Illinois, and it came over from Europe. Germany was dealing with storing corn, silage in the ground, so you had sucking fodder for your cows in the wintertime. And it was during the 1880s that you start seeing it developing on the landscape. Like I said, the early ones being the foundation in the ground, and then by the turn of the century, we started building silos out of wood. The very early ones were just framed up structures with T&G siding on the inside and then whatever the barn siding was on the outside. And then as you move into the first quarter of the 20th century, you start getting into your wood stave and the concrete, poured concrete. You don't start seeing that until the World War I and concrete staves. But between World War I and World War II, they were experimenting with all kinds of silos. The metal silos, the concrete stave, wooden stave, the round hoop ones where the boards were so thin that you could bend them. And then in '48 is when Harvestor started selling their silos through the '50s. And Emily's right, Harvestor was as much a symbol of a hotshot farmer making some money as something just for storing feed. But silos are basically on the way out. They've had kind of 120 years, and now everything is in pump feeders, mainly because you're feeding so many animals, you have to have heavy equipment to handle tons of feed for each feeding, and to handle it by the wheelbarrow load as it comes out of the silo is impractical. And I was going to say, Harvey talked about the Amish wanting to still doing the unloading the silos by hand. They do that. They decide to farm like that. That's the way they want to farm. It's like that, and that's how they. It's not that they have to. That's the way they want to keep the farms going.
Okay, anybody else?
It is interesting as just pits in the ground. So they did start as a horizontal bunker almost, and they went vertical, and now it's as if they're going back. Different scale, but returning to that more horizontal presence in the landscape. So sort of an interesting progression.
Okay, we have another question over here from
Well, I don't have a question. I just want to compliment Jane Pottamer, because when she moved to the town of Pompey, she moved Clarence Smith's old silo, and she built her whole house off of Frank Long Road in the Whitney Estates around that silo. And that silo is her staircase in her contemporary home.
Oh,
So-
wow.
So it's unique.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Emily, I wonder how much you came across silos that
Silo, or if they just built it to look like a silo. But you also see in the architecture of some houses, there is this reference to a cylinder-shaped piece, and then more of a barn-type style. So that language you can find sometimes in other types of buildings. But I didn't come across, in that area, I didn't come across any different types of uses other than storing grain for a grass-fed, or being on a grass-fed farm, or being used for different types of farming. But I know they're out there. I've done some internet searches and seen some pretty crazy uses of silos.
Real estate tax-wise,
Yeah.
silos are taxed as property, eh?
Yeah, that's right, as
Now-
improvements,
As opposed to,
being part of the barn.
okay. Now, what about a horizontal silo or a bunker silo?
I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know how it's,
Not yet.
Taxed like a silo. Silos are a big add-on.
That's a very good
That's why
point.
are coming down to save money to take silo off the land.
there's a lot of insurance associated with having a vertical silo too. One of the farmers that's using his 2 silos right now, he has an operating dairy farm, said that if he hires someone to help him on the farm, his insurance will go through the roof because he has a silo. And the implication is that that worker will be around the silo and working with the silo. So he farms by himself.
Ellen Luxinger. I own a house at Middlefield, New York, outside of Cooperstown, and when we were remodeling, one of the interior walls, I found out it was studded with silo stays.
Oh, neat.
And they still had the silage on them. They never cleaned them off. So,
That's great.
and in Essex County, I did encounter some folks that lived in a silo. They had a beef farm, but they lived in the silo. Converted that to a house.
Wow.
There's a big old barn as you go into Lafayette on Route 20, turn right on Route 11 north. And down there, just kind of across from the police stations, there's a big, huge barn right close to the road with a silo. And that was for sale a few years ago. And at the same time, there was a man walking around Syracuse. And then he was spotted near Lafayette, and it come to find out he was missing. His folks in Ohio, I think it was, they were looking for him for a long time. At the same time, that land and that barn and silo was for sale, and people were in there looking at it. And a man looked up in the silo and found the man hanging up in the top of the silo. And there was quite a bit of land too, and my son bought the barn and silo and built a new house up on the hill behind it.
Yes, it's interesting. There are different associations. I met some people who really dislike them, hate them, have it on their property and refuse to look at it. I met other people who really see it as part of farming and see it as a system and really contributing to their farm. And a lot of it depends on if you've experienced, which side of working with a silo have you encountered. And it's also interesting in the history, there was they grew exponentially. So you'd see one or two silos in the early 1900s, and then it was really as you got into the concrete stave and the harvest store that every farm had a silo. And the growth between those years was just, it was exponential, the number of silos that were going up.
Several times. Well, I am.
Good.
Well, what I mean to say is that I'm not sure a historian could have done this any better. I also see a lot of cultural geography in what you've done. And as you talk about the rural landscape, the silo is like the hayloft. It's another redundant piece on the landscape. So it is a fascinating question to try to envision 50 years from now, what will the eye see as you drive along the rural road?
Yeah.
One of the things that the silo also involved was cooperation. When silo filling time came in Iowa, where I grew up, the neighbors got together, just like thrashing. So the loss of the silo is another indicator of the breakdown of the social fabric in rural areas.
That's a great point. That's something my dad talked a lot
And
about.
With mechanization came the ability of the farmer to go independent. He didn't need his neighbor anymore. And so like the shared telephone line and the thrashing, the silo filling, people became more and more isolated, which I think that human loss of interaction is probably, in my mind, more significant than the loss of the structure itself.
Yeah.
Mammals go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think that's why thinking about the landscape as a museum, you start to unpack all of that meaning from an object. So there's technology, there's a lot of economics involved, but there's also this really rich social aspect to all of these objects and the way that people used to get together to fill them, and farming was a lot more cooperative, and that's just not, that's gone. And again, what will the landscape look like in 50 years, and then how will we all relate? What will the social structures be? And to me, they go hand in hand. So you can look at a landscape and start to unpack from that visual everything that's happening behind the scenes.
Dairy farm, Jersey cows, down in Pompey here on Henbury Road. And I can remember he had a small concrete stave silo, and he had his neighbors fill it for him. He didn't have all the equipment. And when the silo was filled, and he still had some corn, he had a good year, and we're still pouring out in the field, they'd rush around and they'd grab a bunch of snow fence, put it in on a hoop, and line it with tar paper and fill that up. Go up maybe 8, 9 feet with the snow fence, and feed that out real quick.
It's something very well done here, and it reminds me of when I was a young man. One of the best things that ever happened to me is my parents lent me out to one of the neighbor farmers, and talking about a silo, I would climb up in it, and I'd be there on the weekends, Friday night, pitching stuff out Saturday morning. And I wonder why there was this, in the winter, there was this, 4 or 5 foot high frozen thing all around me. And I was told, well, why don't you just get that down out of there and throw it off. And that's exactly what I did. It taught me how to work. The situation that I worked in, there was two sons who had a dad, and he died of pancreatic cancer. And the boys were, oldest was a junior in high school, and the whole thing was, well, what do we do with the farm? Do we sell the farm, move to the small town and try to figure things out, or do we try to run it? And what they did is they put their backs to it and they got the job done. 2 high school kids and me, 15 years old or something like that. Talk about, having a social bond with the land and with the people that are on it. I am thankful, as I would imagine that a lot of you folks are. It's an honor to be on the land. And I have nothing to do with the land now except eat from it. And so I thank you for all your work over the years. And thanks.
Here. I don't romanticize being in a silo when it's 8 below, 4 feet of frozen silage. Now, my cousins, yes, taught me to work, but also to cuss at the same time.
My goodness. Well, this has been great.
I was very involved in all this because she put on the dinners for all these silo filling people, all the threshing people, and those were big dinners, I'll tell you.
Very hungry.
Sandy.
When Milt spoke about the meals, it brought back memories. I grew up on a farm in Vermont, and I went to a one-room schoolhouse just a little bit down the road. I would walk home in the afternoon, and I would hear the, whatever it was called, that sent the silage up.
Blower.
Lord.
Okay, blower. So I knew that there was something fun to watch, but then my mother would put on a huge meal for, I don't know how many farmers used to come. They would go from one farm to another, and I think that was back in our horse days rather than tractor. One day I had to put on the dinner. I felt pretty big about that. I can almost remember what I fixed, but it was probably a bigger meal that she put on than Thanksgiving or Christmas would have been. But this brings back memories.
I think Harv kind of forgot to mention on that steel silo, I don't know what it was. When you climb up there about 4 o'clock in the morning and it's dark, you have 3 or 4 rats running around. That was one of the worst things you could surprise you when you try to stab them with a fork.
Silos, for people that are not aware, don't work closely with them. They can be very dangerous.
Yes.
Put silage in too fast, you don't put it in even in the silos. That's some of the reason for tip over. You don't grab the fork and go in the silo the next day or the day after, or even a week later, without starting the blower first and blowing some air in there. Very dangerous gases. So there's a lot of maintenance, a lot of things that go on with these silos, but they certainly served a purpose and fed a lot of cattle.
Of course, Harvey come up with this thing one time. We had the biggest star in the valley. We had to get up there and rig that star and tie it down on top of there, and I'll tell you, that was a tricky little deal. I don't know how come somebody didn't get hurt that time, but we made it through.
And the star showing, you can see it when you come down 80, you can see it all over the place. It was made out of silo rods, welded together, and 40 bulbs on there probably, 25 watt bulbs. But the danger of climbing up the outside, getting the pipes up, if you didn't leave a permanent pipe up, going up and down those ladders, inside and out, very dangerous.
Several times by Emily and those folks who shared with us. And I'm not afraid to say that those of us in this room, the journey that we're on, memories are one of the only things that we cannot be robbed of. And so it's wonderful that we have these programs and that we hear from each and every one of you. Interestingly enough, when I work with some young children in our school system sometimes, I'll have a chance to kind of evoke some questions. And many times I'll say to them, where do you think your food comes from? Wegmans, Tops, wherever the local grocery store might be. And the sad thing is that these children really today have seen a huge change in our landscape and are living an entirely different life than those of us, perhaps in this room, witnessed and lived. And we either take from that and move forward, which we have to do, but my heart sinks when I see so many farms that have fallen down and silos that have this lisp or this little lean-to, and it amazes me that you drive by a year later and it's still leaning a little bit to the right, not ready to come down yet, folks. And how they stay that way is beyond me. It's interesting that many silos will be like that for long periods of time. But we are living in an entirely different world and a place where our food comes from the land. And if we don't continue to respect the land and continue to support farm folks all across this land, I'm not real sure what's ahead of us, but boy, this has been a great instrument for us to do some thinking. I'll be looking at silos a whole lot closer.
I think that's a great point. Cows, they love the silage, but there's also a farmer, and the work that they did climbing up at a silo at 4 in the morning. I mean, I can't imagine. It's a very selfless profession in a way, very admirable. So thank you again for sharing. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you.